Hi everyone, welcome to the NCS Endgame dungeon presented by me, Elkin. Through this full Endgame course, hopefully you'll be able to learn more about Endgames, how to apply these concepts into the game, and most importantly, revel in their astonishing beauty. So let's get right into the first lesson. So the first concept that we're going to be covering are key squares. Key squares are what we call squares whose occupation by the king assures victory, regardless of whose turn it is to move. So, in this case of the D pawn here, we'll be following the story of the D pawn for a while. I'll just tell you guys the rule. What we want to do is we want to draw a capital T, and the three squares that form the head of the T are the key squares. So we want our king to be there. And in this case, as black, if we were playing black, we would want to deny white access to these key squares permanently. And in that case, that would be a draw. So, in the next scenario, with the D pawn here, now in the 5th rank, the key squares are now a bit different. So not only are the squares here on the tip of the capital T relevant, but also the other 3 squares on the bottom. So here we have a nice little rectangle. Now, on the 6th rank, this pawn is almost into enemy territory, and now here we just want to draw a smaller T, and these 3 squares will be the squares that our king wants to be on. And now, without any much thinking, this should be pretty apparent, because if our king is on any of these squares, well, we have the full runway secure. Black can't really do anything about it. So, one really other interesting case to note is with rook pawns. So with rook pawns, it doesn't matter how far advanced they are, their key squares are always the same. And for the A pawn, the key squares are on b7 and b8. And for the H pawn, it's on h7 and h8. So we never want black to be able to take the corner, otherwise that's a draw. Just want to deny them this space. And also, in some cases, if our king is in the corner, that's bad for us too, because in some cases, black is able to smush our king into the corner, and we would be unable to move. But that is a bit more of a rare scenario. But in general, we do want to control these 2 squares for either of these pawns. Remember, it doesn't matter how far advanced these rook pawns are. So here, we have a bit of a special case with the pawn on the 5th rank and on a knight file, and the 2 kings locked in odd position with white to move. So here we have to be a bit careful and move towards the edge. Let's see what happens if we don't. So if we play c6, black isn't going to follow, but rather play king a7. And after b6, here it's going to be very, very, very difficult to make any progress. Well, it's actually impossible, because no matter what move white makes, black is able to get into a very comfortable stalemating position. For example, here a bunch of moves allow the king to walk in front of the pawn. For example, that is stalemate. And here, this also leads to a stalemate situation. So let's rewind. So here, we have to remind ourselves that black has the corner. That's the only defense that they have. So let's take it away from them. It seems like black is able to hold here, but actually, with a bit of calculation, we find that, nope, black has to run out. We're able to deploy the runway and promote our pawns safely. All right, so here we already have our first challenge. A lot of beginners already fail here, but we'll figure out how to do it. So let's discard our intuition for now and focus on concrete calculation. So instead of making a gut move, let's see what Black's next 3 moves are going to be first. Do any of you guys remember the key square concept? Well, Black's next 3 moves are going to go to e7, d6, and then c6, trying to occupy the key squares of our pawn. So the Black king requires 3 tempi to do that. And they might not have permanent control. That's a very big thing to remember. One thing beginners are tempted to do is to push their pawn. And we can see in this case that that does not work. So, what do we do with our king? We have 2 possible routes. One is to go a more direct route, and one way is to go around the pawn. So, king c2, that's the obvious first move. And here, king e7, let's say king c3, king d6, king c4, king c6. Oh no, we aren't able to use our 4 tempi to our advantage, and Black has cut us off in the key squares. This route is no good. Therefore, we'll have to try the other way to get around. So it seems like Black has control of the key squares here, but here Black is forced to make a move. And here we can see that we're able to reach the very basic endgame position, but with Black in Zugzwang. One important thing to note is that going diagonal in chess with the king is the exact same speed as going straight. This doesn't make sense to us because we usually deal with triangles that follow Euclidean geometry. In this case, the diagonal is the exact same length as the horizontals or verticals, which makes this a non-Euclidean triangle. So that's one thing that you'll have to keep in mind about, is that diagonal distances are the exact same speed as going straight. So we can look through concrete calculation that this path is the correct one. And that is how you should be solving your endgames from now on. So this next endgame example is one of my favorites, and I like to call this one the baptism of fire, since it is probably one of the hardest endgame puzzles for beginners. And the reason for that is this H pawn right here. So I will give you guys some time to think about this. But first of all, plot Black's next moves with their king, their pawn. Try to determine where your key squares will be. And the game plan here is very simple. We need to take this pawn no matter what, and then promote. All right, so welcome back. So let's figure out how this works. So we can see that Black requires 4 king moves to defend their pawn. And it will take us 4 moves to take the pawn this way. So remember that our 4 moves are faster because we're going first, so we have 5 tempi. All right, and we can see that this route is a bit too slow because Black gets here first. So by the process of elimination, king f2 is the best move. Moving our pawn is illogical because that would move our key squares up and also allow Black a chance to defend. All right, so I already know if that Black moves their king, they are bound to lose based on our concrete calculation. So this is where black decides to throw the biggest curveball at us. h4. So h4 may seem like a lost cause attempt to give up the game, but actually this is actually a very, very devious move. Why is that? So if we ignore black's move, clicking f3, of course they're not going to move their king. They're going to play h3, and we're forced to take, basically. If we do take, we are greeted by this ugly mess of an h-pawn. Do you guys remember the key square of the h-pawn? Exactly, g7 and g8. Guess who's getting there first? Black is. Black has the move now. And for example, g3 should immediately be cancelled off your list, since with g3, we're never going to get that h-pawn. No way, this square is cut off. If we go up here, this is going to lose for us. Painful experience. And if we wrap around, black definitely has enough time to occupy the key squares. And with g4, here, black can waste time with h2, king g2, and promote. And here, again, black is fast enough to the key squares as we have moved our pawn too far up, overextended away from our king. So any king f3 variation is horrible. So how do we deal with this? So we have to stay calm. Again, focus on concrete calculations. We can see the problem with the pawn push variations in the earlier king f3 examples was that our king was too far away to get this pawn. And how do we get it now without damaging our own pawn's formation or ruining its key squares? So here, the answer is king g1. That is the fastest way to get the king. Their king still cannot support. And now if they play h3, now g3 is the right time to play, because we only push the key squares one square up, and we are very close to grabbing this pawn. You can see that in this calculated line, again, black is able to occupy the key squares for the moment, but forced out. And guess what? We forced black to move second from this theoretical position. And it should be simply one from here. So let's look at our first tragedy. In this position, many players as white resign or either lose this endgame because they panic that their pawn is lost. Black is going to be a pawn up in a king and pawn endgame. That's not good. But white actually has an ingenious solution to hold the draw here. And this is purely based on key squares. So there are no key squares on the board right now because there are multiple pawns, but we can see that black's key squares for this pawn, when this pawn falls, is going to be these three. Alright, so there are many ways to draw here, but I think the most principled example is to play king c4, allowing the black king in, king c3, and when they take, you're able to hold all of the key squares together with king d3. Now we're in this theoretical position, albeit mirrored or flipped, but it's black's turn to move now. And we know that results in a draw. So here we will be looking at our next tragedy. So in this position, we have what is known as the Philidor position, or an endgame leading up to a Philidor position where it is a draw, even though black is up a pawn. But here, white cannot be too hasty to trade. In this master game, white played Rook f4. And their hope was that after this trade, they would be able to control all the key squares. But white missed black's opportunity to not trade and instead play king g5. And now white is forced to take. But the difference here is that it is now white's turn to move. They have been placed into Zugzwang.